Howdy, y'all. Come on in and rest up. I just got the fire going, so stay a while and let me tell y'all a story to help you fall asleep. Now, I know you're here to wind down and relax, so why don't y'all tell me what helps you relax in the comments below. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories. So let's get to it. This one's a doozy. Happened back in 2005 during Hurricane Katrina. You probably know all about Katrina, but you ain't heard it quite like this. Not from a man who was right smack dab in the thick of it. Now, I'd been fishing these Louisiana waters for over 45 years then. Knew every little nook and cranny of the bayou, every ripple in the Gulf, every dang gull's cry. My boat, she's called the Sea Serpent, a sturdy old girl, built for work, not looks. She's seen her share of storms, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared her or me for Katrina. I remember it like it was yesterday. The radio crackled with warnings for days leading up to it. The weatherman kept saying catastrophic, unprecedented, words that made your gut clench. Most folks evacuated, headed north, inland. But me, I was stubborn, always have been. My house, my life was by the water. I figured I could ride it out. I'd seen hurricanes before, plenty of them. I battened down the hatches, stocked up on supplies, and figured I'd hunker down with a Sea Serpent in a sheltered inlet near Cocodrie, wait for the storm to pass. Biggest mistake I ever made. The storm hit with a fury I couldn't have imagined. The wind, it wasn't just blowing, it was screaming, tearing at everything. The rain felt like needles pounding against the boat. The waves, Lord, the waves. They weren't waves, they were mountains of water, crashing over the Sea Serpent, threatening to swallow her whole. The little inlet I thought would protect me, useless. It became a raging torrent. The Sea Serpent, bless her heart, she held strong. But I was fighting a losing battle. The wind ripped away parts of the cabin. The anchor lines snapped like a twig, and I was adrift, tossed around like a cork in a bathtub. For hours, it was just me, the Sea Serpent in the storm. I clung to the wheel, battling to keep her afloat, praying to anyone who would listen. I remember thinking this was it, the end of old Jerry. I was tired, soaked to the bone, and scared beyond anything I'd ever felt. Then through the blinding rain and spray, I saw it. A light, a faint flickering light. At first I thought I was hallucinating, but it was there, bobbing on the water's surface. As I fought to steer the Sea Serpent closer, I realized it was a house, or at least what was left of one. The house, or what was left, was barely afloat. It had been ripped from its foundations and was being tossed around like a child's toy. On its roof, clinging for dear life, were people. 3 of them. A young woman, a teenage boy, and an elderly man who looked to be in his 80s. My heart lurched. I knew I had to help, but getting close to that house in this storm was suicide. It was like trying to thread a needle in a hurricane. But those terrified faces, I couldn't leave them to die. I wrestled with the Sea Serpent, inching closer, battling the waves, the wind, the rain. It felt like an eternity. Every time a wave crashed over the boat, I thought it would be the end. But I kept going, driven by something bigger than myself. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I was close enough. "Hold on," I yelled, my voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. "I'm going to get you." The young woman looked at me, her face pale with fear. She nodded, her eyes pleading. The boy looked dazed, clinging to her arm. The old man, he just stared, his eyes hollow. Now here's the tricky part. Getting them off that crumbling house and onto the sea serpent wasn't going to be easy. One wrong move, and we'd all be in the drink. I had a rope ladder, thank goodness, but even getting it close enough was a challenge. I maneuvered the sea serpent as close as I dared, fighting to keep her steady. "Throw the ladder," I yelled. The woman, bless her heart, had the presence of mind to help. I saw her grab the ladder as best she could and try to hold on to it. The first one to come across was the boy. He was scared stiff, his limbs shaking, but he was young, agile. I talked him through it, telling him where to put his feet, how to hold on. He made it, collapsing onto the deck of the sea serpent, sobbing with relief. Next was the young woman. She was stronger than she looked, but the waves were relentless, trying to sweep her away. I reached out, grabbed her hand, and hauled her aboard. She collapsed beside the boy, hugging him tight. Now, the old man. He was frail, weak. I knew this would be the hardest. He could barely stand on the roof, let alone climb down a rope ladder in a hurricane. I had to think fast. I couldn't risk him falling. I tied a rope around myself, secured the other end to the sea serpent, and, against my better judgment, jumped onto the roof of the house. It was worse than I imagined. The roof was slick. The wind was tearing at me, and the house was tilting precariously. I crawled over to the old man, who looked at me with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "All right, Pop," I said. "We're going to get you out of here. You just hold on tight to me." I wrapped my arms around him, trying to shield him from the wind and rain. Then, inch by agonizing inch, I started to move him towards the edge of the roof. Every step was a struggle. The wind tried to rip us apart. The waves threatened to wash us away. I could feel the house creaking beneath us, ready to give way at any moment. But I kept going, driven by the sheer will to save this man's life. Finally, we reached the edge of the roof. I managed to grab the rope ladder and secure it to the house. "Now, Pop," I said, my voice hoarse. "You just got to trust me. We're going to go down this ladder together." He nodded, his eyes locked on mine. I started to climb down, holding him tight against me. It was slow, torturous work. The waves crashed over us. The wind howled in our ears. But we kept going, one step at a time. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the deck of the sea serpent. The young woman and the boy rushed to help us. They eased the old man down, wrapped him in blankets, and led him to the small cabin. I collapsed beside them, exhausted but alive. We were safe, at least for the moment. But the storm was far from over. We were still adrift, at the mercy of the elements. The radio was dead, no way to call for help. I knew I had to find some kind of shelter, some place where we could ride out the rest of the storm. But where? Everything was underwater, destroyed. Then I remembered a place, a small, abandoned fishing shack on a tiny island a few miles west. It was rickety, but it was the only chance we had. I fired up the sea serpent's engine and pointed her towards the west. The journey was treacherous. The waves were still huge, the wind still fierce. But I battled on, guided by my knowledge of the waters and the unwavering hope that we could make it. It was a slow, arduous journey. The sea serpent groaned and shuddered, every part of her strained to its limit. Miraculously, we did make it. The fishing shack was still standing, barely. It was a small, one-room structure, battered and worn, but it was dry. We huddled inside, soaked and shivering, but grateful to be alive. The storm raged for another day. We huddled together, sharing stories, trying to keep each other's spirits up. The storm seemed to go on, and a few times we wondered if we were going to make it out alive. We ate what little food I had, rationed it out, and prayed for the storm to end. The old man was weak, but seemed to be holding out. The young woman never stopped trying to keep spirits high, and was a tremendous help in a difficult situation. The boy was thankful to be alive. Finally, on the morning of the third day, the storm began to abate. The wind died down, the rain stopped, and the clouds began to break. The sun peeked through, casting a golden glow over the ravaged landscape. We ventured out cautiously. The scene was one of utter devastation. Everything was underwater. Houses were ripped apart. Trees were uprooted. The world we knew was gone, but we were alive. And that was all that mattered. Then we started to work together to try and salvage what we can. Thankfully, there was a two-way radio in the shack. Soon after, the Coast Guard found us, or more accurately, heard what we were saying from the radio, and we were lifted onto a helicopter and taken to safety. The weeks that followed were a blur of rescue efforts, relief work, and rebuilding. I helped as much as I could, using the sea serpent to ferry supplies and transport people. The sea serpent became a symbol of hope in the midst of despair. I never saw the young woman, the boy, or the old man again, but I often think about them. I wonder what happened to them, where they ended up. I hope they found happiness, a new life, after all they went through. Katrina changed me, son. It showed me the power of nature, the fragility of life, and the importance of community. It taught me that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. It also taught me the resilience of the human spirit, the incredible ability to endure even the most unimaginable hardships. The world, I learned, is not just divided into black and white, but sometimes it's about people helping each other out and trying to survive. And you know what? Even after all these years, whenever a storm is brewing, I think back to Katrina. I think about those three faces, those terrified eyes, and I know that I did the right thing. I know that even in the face of unimaginable danger, it's always worth it to help someone in need. That's my Katrina story, son. A story of survival, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Now, let me get you another glass of iced tea. This old man's throat is dry. All right now, y'all settle in, 'cause I got another tale for you. This one's been sitting in the back of my mind for a while, just waiting for the right time to be told. Now I was probably, maybe 55, 56 years old at the time. Still had a good bit of salt left in my beard, but the years were starting to show. But my boat, the Sea Serpent, she was still chugging along, faithful as ever. I'd had her for over 30 years, and she knew the waters of the Gulf of Mexico better than I knew the back of my hand. It was a scorcher of a July morning, the kind that makes the air shimmer like a mirage. The sun was already beaten down hard by 6, and the humidity was thick enough you could chew on it. I remember wiping the sweat off my brow as I pulled out of the harbor in Biloxi, the Sea Serpent groaning a little as she got underway. I was after red snapper that day, a good mess of them to sell down at the market. I'd been having decent luck, but I was hoping for a real haul. Bait was fresh, tackle was ready, and I had a cooler full of ice. I was set. I headed out to my usual spot, about 20 miles offshore, where the reef dropped off sharp. The GPS coordinates were burned into my memory after all these years. I eased the anchor down, hooked up my line with some cut mullet, and waited. Regular as clockwork. The snapper started biting. I was pulling him in pretty steady for a couple of hours. Nothing huge, mind you. Mostly 2 3-pounders, but enough to make it worth my while. The sun climbed higher, the air got stickier, and the snapper started to slow down. I figured they'd gone deeper to escape the heat. That's when I decided to change things up. I figured I'd troll around a bit, maybe see if I could snag a king mackerel or 2. They like to cruise around those reef edges, chasing bait fish. So I pulled up the anchor, cranked up the engine, and started to motor slowly along the edge of the reef, dragging a couple of lures behind me. Now I'd caught my share of mackerel, and even a few wahoo over the years, but I'd always dreamed of catching a marlin. They were the kings of the Gulf, majestic creatures that could fight like hell. I'd seen pictures, heard stories, but never had one on the line. Honestly, I figured I never would. I was just about to give up on the trolling idea and head back to my original spot when it happened. The reel on my heavy-duty rod, the one I usually used for sharks, started screaming like a banshee. That wasn't no mackerel. That was something big. I grabbed the rod, and the force nearly ripped it out of my hands. Whatever was on the other end was pulling like a freight train. The sea serpent started to list to one side as the line screamed off the reel. My heart was pounding like a drum solo. "All right," I muttered to myself. "Easy does it, Jerry. Don't get too excited." I adjusted the drag, trying to find that sweet spot between letting the fish run and putting too much pressure on the line. I knew that if I clamped down too hard, it would snap. But if I let it run too much, it would spool me. The fight was on. For the first few minutes, all I could do was hold on. This thing was just taking line, heading out to open water like it owned the place. I could feel the power in every jerk and pull. It was an exhilarating, terrifying feeling. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the fish started to slow down a little. I started to gradually reel in some line, gaining a few feet with each turn of the handle. It was slow, agonizing work. My arms burned, my back ached, and sweat poured down my face. I finally managed to get a little bit of the line back, and then the fish jumped. It breached the surface of the water in a spectacular display of power, silver and black scales glinting in the sunlight. I could see its long, spear-like bill and its massive size. It was a marlin, and not just any marlin. This was a monster. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," I whispered. "That's a damn blue one." Now, I knew I was in for a fight. A marlin like that wasn't going to give up easy. I settled in for the long haul, knowing that this could take hours. As I fought the marlin, I started to think about everything I knew about them. I knew they were apex predators, built for speed and power. I knew they were solitary creatures, roaming the oceans in search of food. I knew they were a symbol of the wild, untamed beauty of the sea. I also knew that they were in trouble. Overfishing, pollution, and habitat destruction were threatening their survival. It made me think about what I was doing too. Here I am, this old man trying to catch one of these things. I started to question myself. Should I really be doing this? Was it worth the risk? To the fish? To myself? Just for the thrill of the fight? But then the marlin would surge again, pulling me back to the present moment, back to the battle. I couldn't afford to get distracted. I had to focus on what I was doing. Hour after hour, the fight went on. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The heat grew more intense, and my muscles burned with exhaustion. But I refused to give up. I was determined to see this thing through to the end, one way or another. Sometimes the marlin would run, taking out hundreds of yards of line. Other times it would sound, diving deep into the depths. And then it would jump again, a breathtaking display of raw power. Each time it jumped, it tested my resolve, pushing me to my limits. I drank water, ate a bit of a sandwich, and kept fighting. I knew I had to stay hydrated and keep my energy up if I wanted to have any chance of winning this battle. As the hours passed, I started to feel a strange connection to the marlin. I respected its strength, its tenacity, its will to survive. I also felt a sense of guilt. I was trying to kill something that was so magnificent, so powerful, so vital to the ocean ecosystem. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I couldn't afford to get sentimental. I was in the middle of a fight, and I had to focus on winning. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the marlin started to tire. His runs became shorter, his jumps less frequent. I could feel that I was gaining the upper hand. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to reel it in, inch by inch. My arms ached, my back screamed, but I kept going. I knew that if I gave up now, I would never forgive myself. As the marlin got closer, I could see it more clearly. It was even bigger than I had imagined. It was a magnificent creature with shimmering silver scales, a long pointed bill, and powerful, graceful fins. When I finally got it close enough to the boat, I reached for my gaff. But then I hesitated. I looked into the marlin's eye, and I saw something there, a kind of ancient wisdom, a quiet understanding of the natural world. In that moment, something changed in me. I realized that I couldn't kill this fish. It wasn't about the trophy, or the bragging rights, or the money. It was about respect, about honoring the life of this incredible creature. So I did something that surprised even myself. I lowered the gaff, reached for my knife, and cut the line. The marlin paused for a moment, as if surprised by my actions. Then, with a flick of its tail, it disappeared into the depths. I stood there for a long time, watching the spot where the marlin had disappeared. I felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and exhilaration. I had lost the fight, but I had won something more important. I had honored my own conscience. I reeled in the line, stowed my gear, and started the engine. As I headed back to shore, I couldn't stop smiling. I had a story to tell, a story about the one that got away, a story about respect and the wildness of the sea. Now the story doesn't quite finish there. When I got back to Biloxi, word about my encounter with the marlin had already spread like wildfire. Fishermen, dock workers, and even some tourists gathered around the sea serpent to hear my tale. They were all amazed by the size of the fish, and they were even more amazed by what I did, or rather what I didn't do. "You cut the line?" one of the fishermen asked, incredulous. "After all that fighting? You must be crazy, Jerry." I just shrugged. Maybe I am, I said, but I couldn't do it. It just didn't feel right. Some of them shook their heads, but others nodded in understanding. They knew what it was like to feel a connection to the sea, to respect the creatures that lived there. That night, I went down to the local bar, the Salty Dog, where all the fishermen hung out. As soon as I walked in, everyone started to cheer. "Jerry! Jerry! Jerry!" they chanted. The owner of the bar, Maggie, a tough old woman who knew her way around a fishing boat, came over and gave me a hug. "You're a legend, Jerry," she said. "You showed them all what it means to be a true fisherman." She bought me a beer, and I sat down at the bar, surrounded by my friends and colleagues. We talked about the marlin, about the fight, about the decision I made. As I sat there listening to their stories and their laughter, I realized that I had done the right thing. I had stayed true to myself, and I had earned the respect of my community. But the real reward came a few weeks later. I was out fishing again, trolling along the same reef where I had encountered the marlin. I was hoping to catch a few king mackerel, but I wasn't expecting much. Suddenly I saw something in the distance, a flash of silver, a swirl of water. It was a marlin, and it was heading straight towards my boat. As it got closer, I could see that it was the same marlin I had fought weeks before. I recognized the distinctive markings on its side, the scars from previous battles. The marlin swam right up to the sea serpent and circled the boat a few times. It looked at me with its big, wise eyes, as if to say thank you. Then with a graceful flick of its tail, it swam away, disappearing into the depths once again. I sat there for a long time, watching the spot where it had disappeared. I felt a sense of peace, a sense of gratitude. I knew that I had been blessed, that I had been given a gift. From that day on, I never looked at fishing the same way again. I still loved the challenge, the excitement, the thrill of the catch. But I also had a deeper appreciation for the beauty and the fragility of the ocean ecosystem. I started practicing catch and release more, and I took greater care to minimize my impact on the environment. And every time I went out to that reef, I always looked for that marlin. I never saw it again, but I knew that it was out there, swimming free, a symbol of the wild, untamed spirit of the sea. Y'all hang tight. I ain't done yet. Just gotta let this next story settle in my mind like a good cast sitting in the water. I'll be right back, and when I do, you best believe it'll be worth the wait. It was back in 82, maybe 83. Lord, time flies like gnats on a summer evening. I was still a young feller then, full of vinegar and the need to prove myself. My daddy, bless his soul, had taught me everything he knew about fishing the Gulf, but I was restless, always looking for something bigger, something legendary. The whispers started in the docks down in Biloxi. Fishermen talk, you know, always exaggerating, always trying to outdo each other. But this was different. This wasn't just tavern talk. This was hushed tones and nervous eyes, talk of a monster grouper. They called him Old Leviathan. Now I'd caught my share of big grouper over the years, 100-pounders, maybe even a touch more. But this was different. They said Old Leviathan was different. They said he lived out past the continental shelf, in a spot where the water was dark as ink, and the pressure could crush a submarine. They said he was bigger than a Volkswagen, with eyes like dinner plates and a mouth that could swallow a man whole. Most folks dismissed it as fisherman's lore, a tall tale spun to scare the tourists. But something about the way they talked about him, the fear in their voices, it stuck with me. It got under my skin like chiggers in July. I couldn't shake it. So I started doing my research. I pored over charts, studied the currents, talked to divers who'd gone out that far. Most just laughed in my face, told me I was chasing a ghost. But a few, the ones I trusted, they admitted they'd heard the rumors too. They'd seen things out there, strange readings on their sonar, unexplained shadows in the deep. I had a boat back then, a 28-foot Bertram, named her the Wanderer. She was a sturdy girl, built for the open water. I spent weeks getting her ready, reinforced the hull, upgraded the sonar, rigged up a heavy-duty winch that could haul a small car out of the ocean, and I started preparing my tackle. Now, you got to understand, regular grouper fishing gear ain't going to cut it with something like old Leviathan. I'm talking about thick braided line, strong enough to tow a truck, hooks forged from hardened steel, and a rod that felt like holding a telephone pole. I even had a custom-made lure built, a giant articulated sardine, painted with luminescent paint to attract attention in the deep. My wife, bless her heart, thought I was losing my mind. She'd say, "Jerry, you're going to get yourself killed chasing that fish. Leave it alone. It's just a story." But I couldn't. The idea of old Leviathan had burrowed its way into my soul. I had to know if he was real. Finally, the day came. The weather was perfect. Calm seas, clear skies, and a gentle breeze blowing off the Gulf. I packed the Wanderer with enough fuel, food, and water to last a week. I kissed my wife goodbye, told her I loved her, and pointed the Wanderer's bow towards the horizon. The first few hours were uneventful. The sun beat down, the engine hummed, and the water stretched out in every direction, an endless expanse of blue. As I got further from shore, the other boats disappeared. It was just me, the Wanderer, and the open ocean. Then I hit the spot. The coordinates I'd painstakingly calculated from the charts and the divers' reports. The bottom dropped off sharply, plunging into what felt like another world. The water turned a deep, forbidding blue, almost black. The sonar screen lit up with jagged peaks and valleys, indicating a complex underwater landscape. I cut the engine and let the Wanderer drift. The silence was deafening. All I could hear was the creak of the hull and the distant cries of gulls. I took a deep breath, said a little prayer, and lowered my line. The weight of the lure and the sinker pulled the line taut. It felt like I was lowering a small anchor. I watched the line spool out, counting the meters as they ticked off on the counter. 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. The water was getting colder, darker. Finally, at 300 meters, the line stopped. I was on the bottom. I engaged the reel and started jigging the lure, trying to attract some attention. I waited. Nothing. Just the feel of the current tugging at the line. I waited another hour. Still nothing. Doubt started to creep into my mind. Maybe my wife was right. Maybe this was all a fool's errand. Maybe old Leviathan was just a myth, but I couldn't give up. Not yet. I adjusted my position slightly and tried again. This time I let the lure sit on the bottom for a longer period, hoping to pique the interest of anything that might be lurking nearby. Then it happened. The rod bent double. It was like hitting a brick wall. The line screamed off the reel. I grabbed the rod with both hands, braced my feet against the deck, and held on for dear life. Whatever was on the other end was powerful, incredibly powerful. It was pulling the Wanderer sideways, like she was nothing more than a toy boat. I tightened the drag on the reel, but it didn't seem to make a difference. The line kept screaming out. My arms were aching, my back was burning, and my knuckles were white. I knew that if this thing kept running at this pace, I was going to get spooled. And once that line snapped, whatever was down there would be gone forever. I had to do something. Slowly, carefully, I started to gain some ground. Inch by inch, I cranked the reel, fighting against the immense weight and power on the other end. My muscles screamed in protest, but I refused to give in. For what felt like an eternity, it was a battle of wills. Me against this thing. The sun started to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. The air grew cooler, and the sea became even darker. Finally, after what felt like hours, I started to see some progress. The runs became shorter, the pulls less violent. I was gaining line. I knew I was getting close. Then I saw it. On the sonar screen, a massive shape appeared. It was bigger than anything I'd ever seen. It dwarfed the Wanderer. It was old Leviathan. My heart pounded in my chest. I was terrified, but I was also exhilarated. I had found him. The legend was real. Slowly, painstakingly, I brought him closer to the surface. The strain on the line was incredible. I could feel the heat of the reel burning against my fingers. Then he broke the surface. The sight of him took my breath away. He was enormous. His body was a mottled brown and gray, covered in barnacles and scars. His eyes were huge, like ancient knowing orbs. His mouth was a cavernous maw, lined with rows of razor-sharp teeth. He looked at me, or at least I thought he did. It was hard to tell in the fading light, but I felt a connection, a sense of awe and respect. This was an ancient creature, a survivor. He had seen things I couldn't even imagine. For a moment, we were locked in a silent standoff, me and old Leviathan. Then he did something unexpected. He just stopped fighting. He hung there, suspended in the water, his massive body barely moving. I loosened the drag on the reel and let him rest. I knew that I could probably reel him in, get him close enough to the boat to take a picture, maybe even try to tag him. But something told me not to. I looked at him, at his ancient eyes, at his scarred body. I realized that I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to conquer him. I just needed to know that he was real. So I did the only thing that felt right. I cut the line. The lure, the hook, the leader, all drifted away, sinking back into the depths. Old Leviathan turned slowly and disappeared back into the darkness. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the empty ocean. The sun had set completely, and the stars had started to come out. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull of the Wanderer. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had found what I was looking for, not in the fish itself, but in the journey, in the challenge, in the knowledge that there are still mysteries out there, hidden in the depths of the ocean. I started the engine and turned the Wanderer towards home. The journey back was long and uneventful, but I wasn't the same man who had left. I had seen old Leviathan, and I had learned something about myself in the process. I never told anyone the full story. Most folks wouldn't have believed me anyway. They would have said I was crazy or lying or just plain old making it up. But that's all right. The memory is enough. It's a story that only I know the full truth of. The Wanderer's hull had some damage over the years and ended up being sold for scraps, but it all paid off. That fishing adventure gave me a lifetime worth of stories to tell. I tell you, this next tale's been sitting with me for years, and every time I think on it, I swear it gets better. Let's get to it. You see these weathered hands? They've hauled in a lot of fish in my 68 years, but they've also felt things, unseen things. I was a younger man then, maybe pushing 23, full of vinegar, and convinced I knew everything there was to know about the Santee, Cooper lakes. My daddy taught me everything he knew, and his daddy before him. We were river rats, born and bred, lived and breathed the water. But the Santee Cooper ain't just water, son. It's history, it's mystery, it's something else entirely. This particular night, I was down at the old pier by Utahville. It was a rickety thing even then, mostly patched together with old tires and hope, but it stretched out far enough into the Black River to reach the deep holes where the big catfish like to lurk. I was after a flathead, a true monster, one that could feed a family for a week. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that sticks to you like a wet blanket. The moon was barely a sliver, hiding behind scudding clouds. The only light came from my gas lantern, casting a sickly yellow glow on the water around the pier. The crickets were singing their monotonous song, and the bullfrogs were croaking like grumpy old men. It was a perfect night for fishing, a night you could feel in your bones was going to produce something special. I had my gear all set up, a sturdy old rod my daddy had given me, a reel that whined like a lovesick dog, and a line strong enough to haul a car out of the mud. For bait, I had a live bream, wriggling on the hook like it knew its fate. I cast it out as far as I could, the line singing a little tune in the night air. Then I waited. Now I'd spent countless nights alone on that pier or on the river. Never bothered me none. I knew the sounds of the night, the rustling of the palmetto leaves, the hooting of the owls, the splash of a fish jumping. But this night was different. There was a stillness, a silence that was heavier than the humidity. The crickets stopped chirping. The bullfrogs went quiet. Even the wind held its breath. It was like the whole world was listening, waiting for something. That's when I saw it. Out of the darkness, about 50 yards downriver, a light began to glow. It wasn't harsh like a flashlight or the beam of a car. It was soft, ethereal, like the light from a firefly, but bigger, more intense. It flickered and danced just above the water, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest like a trapped bird. I knew in my gut this wasn't no ordinary light. This was something else, something ancient. The light started to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed. It moved towards me, along the surface of the water, leaving a shimmering trail in its wake. The closer it got, the colder the air became. A chill ran down my spine, raising goosebumps on my arms. My mind raced. Was it a boat? Some kind of swamp gas? I tried to rationalize it, but deep down I knew this was no earthly thing. As the light got closer, I started to hear a sound, a low, mournful hum, like the wind whistling through a hollow tree. It grew louder and louder, vibrating in my bones, filling my head with a sense of dread. Then it was right in front of the pier. The light pulsed, illuminating the water below. And that's when I saw it. Beneath the light, rising from the depths of the Black River, was a figure. It wasn't human, not exactly. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but its features were blurred, indistinct. It was made of water and light, shimmering and swirling, constantly changing. Its eyes were 2 points of intense burning light, and they were fixed on me. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, rooted to the spot like a cypress knee. I could only stare as the figure rose higher and higher out of the water. It reached a height of maybe 7 or 8 feet, towering over me. The humming intensified, and I felt a pressure in my head, a feeling of being probed, examined. It felt like the figure was looking into my soul. Then it spoke, not with a voice, not in words I could understand. It was more like a thought, a feeling, projected directly into my mind. "This is my domain," it said. "You trespass upon my waters." The words weren't spoken, but I understood them perfectly. And with them came a wave of overwhelming sadness, a sense of deep, ancient sorrow. I realized then what I was seeing. It wasn't just some random ghost or spook. It was a river spirit, a guardian of these waters. And it was not happy to see me. I managed to stammer out a reply, my voice trembling. I didn't mean any harm. I was just fishing. The figure remained silent for a moment, its luminous eyes still fixed on me. Then it spoke again. "These waters hold memories," it said, "memories of joy and sorrow, of life and death. You must respect them." I nodded frantically, desperate to appease the spirit. "I do, sir. I do respect them. You seek to take life," it said. "But do you understand the cost?" I didn't know what to say. I'd never thought about it that way before. I'd always just seen fishing as a way to put food on the table, a way to connect with nature. But now, standing before this ancient spirit, I felt a pang of guilt. I don't know, I admitted. The figure seemed to consider this. Then it said, "I will let you be. But remember this night. Remember the respect these waters deserve." And with that, the light began to fade. The figure slowly sank back into the Black River, disappearing into the depths from whence it came. The humming subsided, and the cold air began to warm. The crickets started chirping again. The bullfrogs resumed their croaking. The wind whispered through the palmetto leaves. The world returned to normal, but I was not the same. I stood there on the pier for a long time, shaking like a leaf. I reeled in my line, cut the bream loose, and packed up my gear. I didn't want to catch any fish that night. I didn't want to take anything from the river. As I walked back to my truck, I glanced back at the water. The moon was still hidden behind the clouds, but I could almost feel the presence of the river spirit, watching me, reminding me of the lesson I had learned. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. Who would believe me? They'd just think I was crazy, spending too much time alone in the woods. But I couldn't forget it. The memory of the river spirit, the feeling of its presence, the weight of its words, it stayed with me. The next day I went back to the pier, but this time I didn't bring my fishing gear. I just sat there on the edge of the water, listening to the sounds of the river. I tried to understand what the spirit had meant about the memories and the respect. Over the next few weeks, I spent more time observing the river than fishing in it. I watched the birds, the otters, the turtles. I studied the way the water flowed, the way the sunlight danced on its surface. I learned about the history of the area, the stories of the Native Americans who had lived here for centuries, the battles that had been fought along its banks. I began to see the river not just as a place to catch fish, but as a living, breathing entity, a repository of history and memory. And I realized that the spirit was right. These waters deserved respect. Now I still fish. It's in my blood. I can't help it. But I fish differently now. I'm more mindful of the impact I have on the environment. I release more fish than I keep. I try to leave the river cleaner than I found it. And sometimes, when I'm out on the water at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A light flickering on the surface, a ripple that doesn't seem quite natural. And I'll remember that night on the pier, and I'll say a silent prayer of thanks to the river spirit for teaching me a lesson I'll never forget. That night changed me, son. It taught me that there's more to this world than what we can see and touch. It taught me to respect the power of nature, the wisdom of the old ways, and the importance of listening to the voices of the past. So, the next time you're out on the water, remember old Jerry's story. Respect the river. Listen to the silence. And maybe, just maybe, you'll hear the whisper of the river spirit too. You might just learn something you never expected. And always remember, son, those are the best kinds of stories. The kind that make you believe. The kind that make you think. The kind that stay with you long after the embers have died down and the fire's gone out. Now, get some rest. Tomorrow, we'll go fishing. But remember what I told you. Respect the river. I was just sitting here, remembering another time out on the water, and I figured, why keep it to myself? Let me tell you all about it. Well, I got one that ain't just about fish, though there were plenty of them involved. This one's about humanity, I guess. It was back when I was a young buck, barely out of my teens and full of more vinegar than sense, drafted into the Army during that mess in Vietnam. I wasn't a soldier, really, more of a logistical fella they stuck me with. Ended up stationed down in Louisiana, near a small town called Bayou Chain. Had a little base there, mostly for training and processing. Now Bayou Chain, it's a sleepy little place, thick with cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, and the water runs slow and muddy. Folks there, they lived off the land, and mostly off the fish in that bayou. I'd grown up fishing myself, out on the Gulf Coast, so I felt right at home, even in uniform. But the thing was, this base started getting these refugees, folks fleeing conflicts in Southeast Asia, mostly Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian. They were scared, confused, didn't speak a lick of English, and about as familiar with Louisiana as a polar bear would be. They'd been through hell. You could see it in their eyes, losing their homes, their families, everything. We were supposed to get them settled, teach them the basics, help them find their footing in a brand new world. Problem was, nobody really knew how. The Army was good at fighting wars, not so much at rebuilding lives. So these folks were just existing, eating the army food which they didn't much care for, and staring out at the bayou with this lost look. I saw it, and it just bothered me. Back home, fishing wasn't just a hobby. It was life. It was how we fed our families, how we relaxed, how we connected with the world around us. I figured maybe, just maybe, I could teach them something that would help them feel a little less lost, a little more connected to their new home. So I went to my commanding officer, a gruff old bird named Captain Thompson, told him my idea about teaching the refugees to fish. He looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Fish, Miller? You want to teach them to fish? We got paperwork to do, Miller. We got regulations to follow. We ain't running a fishing camp here. I pleaded my case, told him how it could help them, give them a skill, a sense of purpose, maybe even a little bit of peace. He finally sighed, rubbed his temples, and said, "All right, Miller, you want to waste your time on this, you go ahead. But don't let it interfere with your regular duties. And if they start complaining about the worms, I'm holding you responsible." I grinned, saluted, and got to work. First thing I did was scrounge up some old fishing gear. The base had a storage shed full of forgotten supplies, and I managed to find a few rusty rods and reels, some tangled fishing line, and a box of rusty hooks. Next, I had to find someone to translate. I found a young Vietnamese woman named Mai, who had learned some English in a refugee camp before coming to Louisiana. She was quiet, but her eyes were sharp, and she was eager to help. Together, we rounded up a group of refugees, maybe a dozen or so, men and women, young and old. They looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. I could tell they didn't quite understand what I was trying to do. I took them down to the bayou, showed them the gear, and started explaining the basics: casting, reeling, baiting the hook. It was slow going. Language was a barrier, of course, but so was culture. They weren't used to this. They were farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, not fishermen. The first few days were a disaster. Tangled lines, lost hooks, and a whole lot of blank stares. They were frustrated. I was frustrated. And Mai was running herself ragged trying to translate everything. One old man, he was probably in his 70s, he looked at me with a sad smile and said something to Mai in Vietnamese. She translated, "He says he is too old for this. He will never learn." I knelt down beside him, took his gnarled hand in mine, and said, "Sir, you are never too old to learn, and you don't have to be a master fisherman to catch a fish. Just be patient and listen to the water." I showed him again, slowly, how to bait the hook, how to cast the line, how to feel for the tug of a fish. He watched me carefully, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. And then it happened. He got a bite. His eyes widened. He gripped the rod tight, and he started reeling. The line sang as the fish fought back. He struggled, but he kept at it, his face flushed with exertion. Finally, he landed it. A small bream, no bigger than my hand, but to him it was a trophy. He held it up, his eyes shining, and let out a whoop of joy that echoed across the bayou. That was the turning point. Suddenly, everyone was eager to learn. They watched the old man. They asked questions. They practiced their casting. The frustration was replaced with excitement, the suspicion with camaraderie. Mai and I, we worked our tails off. We showed them how to identify different types of fish, how to clean them, how to cook them. We taught them about the bayou, about the plants and animals that live there, about the importance of respecting the environment. They learned quickly, these folks. They were resourceful, resilient, and hungry to learn. They started catching fish, not just bream, but catfish, bass, even the occasional gar. They started trading fish with the locals for vegetables and rice. They started to smile. It wasn't easy, mind you. We had our share of setbacks, arguments, misunderstandings, equipment failures. But we persevered. We learned from each other. We laughed together, and we fished together. One evening, after a long day of fishing, I sat down with Mai by the bayou. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The refugees were cleaning their catch, their voices mingling with the sounds of the crickets and the frogs. Mai turned to me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Jerry," she said. "You have given them more than just fish. You have given them hope." Her words hit me hard. I hadn't realized the impact I was having. I just wanted to help, to share something I loved with people who needed it. But I had done more than that. I had given them a way to connect with their new home, a way to provide for themselves, and a way to find joy in the midst of hardship. The weeks turned into months, and the refugees started to integrate into the community. They found jobs, they enrolled their children in school, they started to build new lives. They still came down to the bayou to fish, though. It had become their sanctuary, their refuge, their connection to something bigger than themselves. Eventually, my time in the Army came to an end. I was discharged, and I went back home to the Gulf Coast. I lost touch with most of the refugees, but I never forgot them. Years later, I was visiting New Orleans, and I decided to take a drive out to Bayou Cheney. I wanted to see if the base was still there, if the bayou was still as beautiful as I remembered. The base was gone, replaced by a small industrial park. I drove down to the bayou, parked my car, and walked down to the water's edge. And there they were. A group of people, men and women, young and old, fishing. They were speaking a mixture of English, Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian. They were laughing, they were sharing stories, and they were catching fish. I stood there for a long time watching them, my heart filled with a quiet joy. I didn't approach them, didn't want to intrude. I just wanted to see that they were still here, still fishing, still thriving. As I turned to leave, one of the women looked up and saw me. Her eyes widened and she called out, "Jerry? Is that you, Jerry Miller?" I turned back and she ran towards me, her face beaming. It was May. We hugged and she introduced me to her family, her husband, her children, her grandchildren. They all remembered me, remembered the fishing lessons, remembered the bayou. They told me stories about how fishing had helped them survive, how it had brought them together, how it had given them a sense of belonging. They told me about the old man who had caught the first bream, how he had become a legend in their community. They invited me to stay for dinner, and I spent the evening with them, eating fish that they had caught from the bayou. It was the best meal I had ever had. As I drove away that night, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had gone to war, but I had also done something good. I had helped a group of people find their way in a new world. And I had learned that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, always beauty, and always the possibility of connection. So there you have it. That's my fishing story. It's not just about the fish, though. It's about the people, the bayou, and the lessons I learned along the way. It taught me that sometimes the simplest things in life, like a fishing rod and a quiet body of water, can make the biggest difference. And that, friend, is a lesson worth more than all the fish in the sea. Hope you're ready, because this next story's got a pull to it, just like a big one on the line. Let's get to it. See, I've always been drawn to the legend of Old Man Tiber. Now, I'm not talking about a person. Old Man Tiber was the name local folk gave to this massive mythical catfish that supposedly lived in the darkest depths of the Mississippi River, way down south near the Louisiana border. Folks said he was bigger than a rowboat, with whiskers like mooring ropes and a temper to match. Most dismissed it as just a tall tale, something to scare kids away from the river's edge. But I always held a healthy dose of respect and a sliver of belief for the old legends. Back then I was younger, stronger, and a whole heap braver or maybe dumber, depending on how you look at it. I had this little 16-foot aluminum boat, the Salty Siren, I called her. She wasn't much to look at, but she was reliable, and she knew the river like the back of my hand. Me and that boat, we were partners. So the summer of '92 was especially hot and dry. The river was low, and the fish were sluggish. I was catching enough to keep my head above water, but nothing spectacular. But something was different that year. The old-timers, the ones who'd been fishing the Mississippi their whole lives, they were all talking about strange currents, unusually large disturbances in the water, and missing nets, sturdy, industrial-strength nets, ripped to shreds like confetti. Of course, the whisper of Old Man Tiber grew louder. Some claimed to have seen him, a fleeting glimpse of a dark, monstrous shape beneath the murky surface. I told myself it was just the heat playing tricks on their minds, but the seed of curiosity, that little fishing bug, had been planted. I decided I wanted to research. I took out my old maps, the ones my granddaddy used to have. They were filled with notes and marked locations of prime fishing spots. I scoured them, and the details that were drawn up matched all the old legends and sightings of Old Man Tiber, and discovered it all centered around a particularly deep bend in the river, known as the Devil's Elbow. The current there was treacherous, swirling around submerged trees and rock formations, creating a natural whirlpool. It had always been a dangerous spot, avoided by most fishermen. Of course, I was not most fishermen. For weeks I researched and read, and asked all the local fishermen and historians about the legends of Old Man Tiber. I spent days studying the currents and mapping the underwater terrain with my old depth finder. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that there was something extraordinary lurking in those depths. Now, I'm not usually one for fancy equipment. I'm more of a hook, line, and sinker kind of guy. But if I was going after something legendary, I knew I needed to up my game. So I went down to Cletus's Bait and Tackle, the only decent shop for miles, and I told him my plan. Cletus, he was a grizzled old cuss with a walleye-shaped birthmark on his cheek and a permanent smell of catfish stingbait clinging to him. He listened to my story with a skeptical glint in his eye. Old Man Tiber, huh? You gone loco, Jerry? That's just a myth, a story to scare greenhorns. Maybe, I said, but I'm going to find out for myself. Cletus chuckled, a dry, raspy sound, like sandpaper rubbing against wood. Well, if you're dead set on it, I reckon I can help you out. But don't come crying to me when that monster rips your arms off. He sold me the heaviest duty rod and reel he had, the kind used for deep-sea fishing. The line was braided steel, thick enough to tow a car. He even threw in a special extra-large hook, one he swore was big enough to snag a small whale. For bait, I did some research. Some say that the old river monsters like the taste of bullhead catfish, and some say they like bluegill. I rigged my line up with a huge live bluegill, hooked right through the back, and added a massive weight to get it down to the bottom. The next morning, before the sun even thought about peeking over the horizon, I loaded up the salty siren and headed towards the Devil's Elbow. The air was thick with humidity, and the mist hung low over the water, giving the river an eerie, almost primordial feel. As I approached the bend, I could feel the current tugging at the boat, a constant reminder of the power lurking beneath the surface. I found a relatively calm spot just outside the main whirlpool, anchored the boat as securely as I could, and dropped my line. The weight pulled the bait down quickly, disappearing into the murky depths. Then I waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, baking the boat. Sweat dripped off my brow, stinging my eyes. I swigged sweet tea and battled mosquitoes, wondering if I was wasting my time. Maybe Cletus was right. Maybe Old Man Tiber was just a myth. Just as I was about to reel in my line and call it a day, something happened. The rod tip twitched, just a subtle movement, almost imperceptible. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Then it happened again, a more pronounced tug. "It's on," I muttered, my voice trembling with excitement and a healthy dose of fear. I grabbed the rod, bracing myself. The line went taut, singing a high-pitched whine as something huge started pulling. This wasn't like any fish I'd ever caught before. It wasn't the sharp, erratic jerks of a bass or the steady pull of a gar. This was a slow, deliberate, unstoppable force. The boat lurched violently, nearly throwing me overboard. I gripped the sides, fighting to maintain my balance. The reel screamed as line peeled off at an alarming rate. I tightened the drag, but it barely slowed the beast down. "All right, you prehistoric son of a gun," I grunted, my muscles straining with the effort. "Let's see what you're made of." The battle was on. For what felt like an eternity, I fought that creature. It would pull, I would reel. It would dive, I would resist. My arms ached, my back screamed, but I refused to give up. This wasn't just about catching a fish anymore. This was about proving something to myself, about confronting the legend, about staring into the face of the unknown. The current was working against me, trying to drag the boat into the whirlpool. I fought to keep it pointed upstream, using the motor to compensate for the relentless pull. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the little boat into an oven. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I began to gain ground. The line tightened, the reel clattered, and I could feel the creature tiring. It wasn't giving up, but its movements were becoming less powerful, less deliberate. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally started to see something. A dark shape began to emerge from the depths, growing larger and larger as it neared the surface. My heart leaped into my throat. It was immense. I'm talking about a fish that dwarfed my boat. Its body was long and thick, covered in leathery, mottled brown skin. Its head was massive, with beady, ancient-looking eyes and a cavernous mouth that could swallow a basketball whole. And those whiskers. They were indeed like mooring ropes, thick and bristly, trailing in the water like seaweed. Old man Tiber. He was real. I stared at him in awe and terror, a primal fear gripping me. This wasn't just a fish. It was a leviathan, a relic of a bygone era, a creature that had witnessed centuries of history unfold along the banks of the Mississippi. For a moment, we were locked in a silent standoff, man and monster, separated by a thin line of braided steel. He looked at me with an ancient, unknowable gaze, his eyes reflecting the sunlight like polished obsidian. Then he made a move. With a sudden surge of power, he dove beneath the boat, pulling the line taut. The boat rocked violently, and I lost my footing, stumbling forward. In that moment of disarray, something snapped. Not the line, but something in me. I realized that I was in over my head. This wasn't a game anymore. This was a battle for survival. I reached for my knife, a trusty old Bowie that had been in my family for generations. With a deep breath, I sliced through the line. The sudden release of tension was almost deafening. The boat shuddered, then slowly righted itself. I watched as old man Tiber disappeared back into the depths, his massive form fading into the murky shadows. I sat there for a long time, panting, shaking, my body aching from the fight. The sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the water. I felt a mixture of relief, disappointment, and profound respect. I didn't catch old man Tiber, but I saw him. I felt his power. I knew that the legend was real. I reeled in the severed line, retrieving the broken end. As I examined it, I noticed something odd. The steel braid wasn't just cut. It was frayed almost, melted. It was as if something had burned through it with intense heat. I looked back towards the devil's elbow, a shiver running down my spine. Maybe old man Tiber was more than just a giant catfish. Maybe he was something else. I didn't fish the devil's elbow again for a long time. The memory of that encounter was too vivid, too unsettling. But the legend of old man Tiber never left me. Years later, I heard stories of other fishermen encountering him. Some claimed he was still guarding the depths of the Mississippi, a silent sentinel of the river. Others said he had moved on, seeking new territories, new waters to dominate. I don't know the truth, but I do know this. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that defy logic and reason. And sometimes the best thing we can do is to respect those mysteries and leave them undisturbed. As for the devil's elbow, well, it's still there, swirling and churning, a reminder of the day I came face to face with a legend. And every time I pass it, I can't help but wonder if old man Tiber is still lurking down there, waiting for the next unsuspecting fisherman to challenge his dominion. Well, now, I sure hope y'all enjoyed those stories as much as I enjoyed telling them. Ain't nothing better than sitting back, swapping tales, and feeling like we're all out on the water together. I'll be back tomorrow, same as always, with another one for you. Maybe something that'll have you smelling the bayou air or feeling that tug on the line, like you're right there with me. Till then, y'all rest easy, keep your spirits high, and don't forget, the best stories are the ones we carry with us. See y'all soon, and please feel free to sit back and enjoy the sounds of nature.